I'm pretty sure Space Invaders was the first video game I played in the arcade, so when I had a chance to add a used 40th anniversary Arcade1Up cabinet to my collection, I jumped at it. Since picking it up, I've made a few upgrades to this machine, including adding an adjustable volume knob, new vinyl graphics, and a lighted marquee. But even though I made these improvements, the game still lacks something. It wasn't until I looked at how Taito had built the original 1978 Space Invaders cabinet that I put my finger on it. The original game had a CRT monitor mounted in the middle of the cabinet, which reflected upward into a tilted mirror. When you played the game, you were looking at this reflected image. The mirror was semi-transparent, and behind it was a shadow box with a simple paper moonscape and star field. When illuminated, you could see the moonscape through the translucent mirror. So when I played my Arcade1Up Space Invaders with its flat, close-up black and white screen, what I really wanted to see was this, Space Invaders as it was originally played. Once I had the mental image in my head, I just couldn't let it go. So I set to work on trying to get as close to the original viewing experience as possible without having to find a semi-translucent mirror. The Arcade1Up cabinet has about 6 to 7 inches of depth to spare behind the top of the monitor. I figured one way to simulate the original game was to simply recess the screen with a new bezel and graphics. I disassembled part of the cabinet to test the idea. First, I disconnected the power input and the ribbon cable from the control deck. Next, I removed the bezel and then the monitor. The monitor is held in place with 8 screws. And be sure to have someone help you with this, as the monitor literally dropped out of my cabinet as soon as I removed the last screw. I had to make a quick test on the workbench, which fortunately showed no damage was done. After mocking up the idea using a spare centipede bezel, I set to work on making a shadow box from 1/2-inch MDF to recess the screen. I cut all the parts on my table saw. The board that holds the monitor measures 18 5/8 inches tall by 17 11/16 inches wide. The recessed monitor needs to be at a shallower angle than the bezel to be properly viewed, so the top board and the bottom board are different sizes. The top board measures 5 inches deep and has a 16-degree angle cut into one edge. The bottom board measures 4 inches deep. The shadow box needed to sit lower in the cabinet for the screen to appear properly through the front glass. I added a 1-inch lip to the bottom of the original screen mounting board, and I attached it using 3 1 5/8 inch screws. I then slipped the centipede plexiglass into place to represent the recessed screen and reassembled the cabinet. As shown here, the test proved the new viewing angle would work well while playing the game. Disassembling all the parts once more, I marked the location of the screen on the new monitor board using the original monitor as my guide. The metal frame that holds the screen is attached with 4 screws that stick out from the sides. You need to make sure that you have clearance for those screws when you cut the opening. So I marked the location of the screws as well as the support tabs and made the correct cuts. The supporting tabs are recessed on the original game to keep them and their mounting screws from interfering with the bezel, so they need to be recessed on the new board as well. I drilled out the corners and the notches for the mounting screws using a 1-inch Forstner bit, and then I used my saber saw and a scrap piece of MDF as a straight edge to cut out the center of the board for the screen. Before removing that cutout, I used my router to make a 1/2-inch wide by 1/8 inch deep groove at the top and the bottom of the screen opening for the monitor's mounting tabs. Back at the workbench, I tested the fit. The screen dropped into the new mounting board perfectly. After squaring it up, I drilled its mounting holes as well as those for the bezel. I then installed the monitor using its 8 screws. I wiped everything down thoroughly with a microfiber cloth, as MDF produces a lot of dust, and then I replaced the bezel. Next, I installed the monitor assembly into the cabinet and added new corner support brackets. Arcade1Up uses white plastic L brackets on all of its games to give the monitor extra support. I found something similar on Amazon.com, and I used 3/8 inch screws to attach the brackets to the cabinet. Putting the cabinet back together again, I conducted another test. Despite the centipede graphics on the bezel, the recessed monitor looked really good, and the game played well. Satisfied this was going to work, I next turned my attention to the graphics. I've used Etsy seller LoudGraphX to do several custom projects for me. Manu from LoudGraphX did a spectacular job designing and printing the materials for my Fantastic Four pinball cabinet, so I reached out to him again for this project. I emailed him a few photos of the original Space Invaders game, as well as a simple sketch of what I needed and all the dimensions. Within a couple of days, he sent me electronic artwork for approval, and in less than a week, I had new vinyl graphics for the shadow box sitting on my workbench. My first step was to cut out the center of the monitor using a sharp hobby knife, a cutting mat, and a straight edge. Because Space Invaders is the only game on this cabinet, I had the bezel designed so the moonscape covered the unused portion of the bottom of the monitor. The moon projects approximately 1 1/4 inches into the base of the screen. To ensure the graphics would appear continuous, they were printed on a single sheet of vinyl, so I used the centipede bezel again to mark and cut off the top and bottom pieces for the shadow box. I then applied the vinyl to the bezel by peeling away the bottom inch of the backer. I then seated the vinyl to the bottom of the plexiglass and smoothed it onto the surface using a microfiber cloth. I then flipped the bezel over and removed the overhanging vinyl with my knife and cut out the 4 screws. When complete, I attached the bezel to the new monitor board using 4 1/2-inch black screws. Before applying the vinyl to the top and bottom boards, I drilled 2 1 1/8-inch holes in the front corners of each to accommodate a set of 12-volt LED push buttons. I used colored LED push buttons as an easy way to illuminate the shadow box, and it was essential for the 3D effect to work. Because the game and the marquee of this cabinet are powered by a 12-volt power supply, if you do this, be sure you buy 12-volt LED buttons. I ordered 2 orange and 2 blue push buttons from DIY Retro Arcade. This seller also goes by Nifty Tech LLC on eBay, and I ordered wiring harnesses for the LEDs from him as well. To complete the wiring, I also purchased a female 5.5mm pigtail from Amazon, as well as more insulation displacement connectors from Micromark. The LED push buttons are powered from a splitter installed on the 12-volt power supply. To build the LED harness, I started with 4 of the paired JST leads. I slipped shrink tubing over the brass plugs to insulate them from each other, then clipped off the white JST plugs as they were unnecessary for this project. Next, I used insulation displacement connectors to attach 24 inches of red and black 16-gauge wire to the 5.5mm female pigtail. I then attached 2 pairs of leads to the bottom of these wires and 2 pairs to the top. With the harness complete, I then applied the Starfield vinyl to the top of the MDF board, wrapping it over the edge to help seat it. I cut away the vinyl from the button holes and installed the 2 blue LEDs. I marked the plus and minus terminals on the back of the board and then installed it in the shadow box. Incidentally, the LED power terminals on the push buttons are the 2 that stand separate from the gray switch housing. I repeated the process for the bottom board, applying the vinyl, wrapping the excess around the edge to help seat it, and installing the LED buttons. Even with the shadow box sitting on my workbench, I was excited at how it looked because I knew this was going to work. I installed the shadow box into the cabinet for the last time and wired up the LEDs. The black wires go to the negative power terminals on the buttons. To test it, I plugged the machine's 12-volt power supply directly into the pigtail. The LEDs provide just enough glow to illuminate the moonscape but produce very little glare on the screen itself. Happy with these results, I reassembled most of the cabinet with the exception of the control deck. As a final detail, I swapped the game's fire button for a white LED. After removing the control deck's dust cover, I popped the white button from the board by squeezing the 2 locking tabs inward. I then installed the 12-volt white LED in the hole and attached a new set of switch leads using the spade connectors on the button terminals and inserting the JST plug into the circuit board. To light the fire button, I tapped into the 12-volt harness supplied by Arcade Game Factory with their lighted marquee kits. I'd installed one of these kits on this cabinet in a previous video, and you can find it on my YouTube channel, Pop Art Studios. You need to be careful when you make this connection as it's also part of the on-off switch. Make the connections at the location shown using more suitcase connectors and another LED lead. With the wiring complete, I plugged the leads into the LED's power terminals and then used a zip tie to gather the loose wires. I replaced the dust cover and put the control deck back into the cabinet. After attaching the remaining connections, I powered up the game and was gratified to see everything light up as it should, including the fire button. The recessed screen with its custom graphics really makes this game something special. Although it's not an exact duplicate of how the original game appeared in 1978, it has the right feel when you're playing it. And since the cabinet has just Space Invaders on it, I was able to apply the moonscape over the unused portion of the screen, providing that 3D look of the original. As it says in the title, this is a crazy project, and I seriously doubt any of you will try it. But if you do, be sure to contact Manu at LoudGraphX through Etsy and tell him you saw this video. He should be able to make you the same shadow box insert he made for me, and you can order it just like any other vinyl bezel from his store. For more easy modification videos on this Space Invaders cabinet and other Arcade1Up games, check out my YouTube channel, Pop Art Studios. And if you find these videos helpful or at least mildly entertaining, consider subscribing.